So I was telling you before my camera blew up on me that why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. I told you it's the result of long-term issues, of course, the rivalry between Japan and the United States, and the racism that manifests primarily in California against Japanese Americans, which really offended the sensibilities of the Japanese. And then the short-term issues associated with the war in China, where the Americans simply saw the war as a war of atrocity, that the Chinese behavior was beyond the pale, and then decided to punish them for it. First embargoing scrap iron, and then embargoing oil. And the embargo of oil was the one that really has the huge impact. The Japanese, at risk of running out of gasoline relatively quickly, in about 6 months, had to find an alternative source. The source that they will look to is here in Indonesia, a major oil-producing area even to this day. But to get to Indonesia, you had to go through the Philippines, and to go through the Philippines, you had to go through the United States. So, you know, what the Japanese did basically was another lessons of history lesson. They looked at the Americans, and over the past decade or so, they saw that they were overwhelmingly isolationist, that they were overwhelmingly pacifistic, and that they were trying to do everything they possibly could to remain neutral. And the Japanese sort of, you know, and here's their little gamble. They thought if they just take one big swing, you know, hit the Americans upside the head, destroying the Pacific Fleet, then that would lead the Americans, of course, to simply, you know, turn tail and run, I guess, you know, because they wouldn't want to be involved in this large situation. Clearly, they misinterpreted the American attitude, because we all know, you know, what's going to happen. The next day, Roosevelt goes before Congress. He is one of his powerful speeches yesterday, December 7th, a day that will live in infamy. Infamy, of course, means, you know, the infamous, the bad, it will remain and will remember it as just this horrible kind of situation. He basically doesn't say, you know, declare war. He says a state of war now exists. And if you think about it, that is true, right? The Japanese had attacked the United States of America, so a state of war now exists, and he simply called upon Congress to recognize that fact. And indeed, Congress will do so very quickly, of course, as the United States will enter the war against Japan in the first instance, but ultimately against the entire set of the Axis powers. I always love that, you know, there's this one little statement, of course, that what happens, you know, when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, it transforms the American attitude. They awake the sleeping giant. You know, the United States was essentially the giant of international politics, and you know, with a potential war-making capacity, of course, that would go far beyond any other nation. And indeed, you know, when the Americans would go up against the Japanese, you know, we shot down their planes, they shot down ours, but you know, we could always replace that plane, and the Japanese couldn't do that. We could always replace that ship, and the Japanese couldn't do that. And we could simply outproduce them, you know, with this monumental war-making capacity that will ultimately overwhelm. Okay, I'm not going to say a lot about the war as the war itself. It's kind of the same story as World War I, except over a longer period of time. The United States, as they enter the war, of course, bring their extraordinary might to bear upon this war, and that ultimately will lead to the victory. It's going to be a lot more difficult, though, than, you know, of course, the way it was in World War I. Huge theaters of war. There is of course, the European theater, and the question is, how will the United States get at Germany and the Axis powers? You know, and they're going to take a circuitous route. They're going to go first to North Africa, then across over to Italy, and then only finally in 1944, of course, you know, the D-Day invasion that will bring them into the center point of Europe. The Pacific theater was very complicated as the Japanese expanded, of course, across a huge area of the Western Pacific. That meant that the Americans would have to kind of route them out island by island. They didn't take every single island, but they took like the critical ones, you know, hopscotching a little bit and making it so that the island left behind, of course, was basically redundant on their way ultimately to Japan. But you know, in the end, of course, it's the extraordinary might, power, economic largesse of the United States that just comes into play here and just will ultimately lead to the American victory. What I really want to tell you, though, about World War II is not so much about the war and how it works out. It's a critical story, of course, and lots of different ways that you guys could get into that if you want to. Of course, I've seen on Netflix recently, I think it was, The War in Color. So you get to see color film of World War II, really interesting stuff. I want to focus our attention, however, on the home front. So what's happening in the United States during this, in World War I, I focused more about what was happening, of course, internationally. This time, I want to focus more on what's happening at home. Now, one thing that I have an image of war, I have all these images of war in my head, but war is kind of revolutionary. War as revolution. You know, it changes things, and I always thought that that's kind of the thing you have to contemplate. If you go to war, it's going to change everything, and often in ways that you cannot expect, you know, often unintentional outcomes that will be associated with the war. And I think World War II has that kind of thing. Whatever they thought they were getting into at the beginning, of course, becomes so much different in so many ways, in terms of the ultimate impact when it is all over. And I do want you to perceive World War II as a revolution for the United States of America. It's revolutionary in terms of the economy. The economy is just, struggling just in whatever way you can think of during the Great Depression, and now it's booming as it just kind of, shoots through the roof, and all of this war productivity ultimately turning out, I can't remember what it was, 245,000 planes, and I mean a new ship every 10 hours, at least out of the Kaiser Steel, the Liberty ships as they're produced, and just this enormous productivity that will allow the American economy to be absolutely the most powerful in the world. In 1945, for a moment there, the United States economy represented more than 50% of the global economy. It's very uncommon for any one country to be in that position. And admittedly, it was only momentary. The German economy was sunk, the Japanese economy was destroyed. But it kind of shows you the relative strength of the American economy. So a revolution in the economic situation as the Americans go from dire situation to this incredibly booming economy. By 1945, GNP is like $245 billion, so up from the $105 billion that I told you about in 1929, and just exploding through the roof. It was a revolution in terms of international politics. I should at least mention that in international relations. The United States will ultimately, out of World War II, reject the notions of isolationism and embrace the notions of interventionism. There's no doubt about that. So a total transformation in the role of the United States relative to the rest of the world. I guess World War I was the cautionary tale. If the Americans step back from global involvement, the war will go to hell. If the United States steps forward, of course, then the world will at least have some kind of structure to it. And it will establish what we call the Pax Americana, the long-term American peace that's got a whole lot of problems and a whole lot of little wars going on, but still, no world war since the Americans have assumed their position of global hegemony. So this kind of revolution in technology, there's no doubt about that. If you think of all the things that are going to come out of this, detergents and DDT and sonar and radar and the first computers, of course, splitting of the atom, nuclear weapons, and just this blood plasma, the first significant use, of course, of antibiotics, all these things that come into play as a result of World War I, just revolutionizing modern technology, revolutionizing the modern world in many ways, of course, with all of these things that will have their various applications across the economy. So there's just a tremendous amount of change that will be wrought by World War II that will just have a huge impact upon America in a variety of different ways. But what I want to do is focus our attention on three particular minorities who were impacted by World War II in very powerful kind of ways. And the first community I want to suggest to you that was impacted by World War II was the African American community. And what happened was that it was this incredible demand for participation and involvement on the part of everyone in the United States. And so during World War II, African Americans were drawn into the larger American economy, into the larger American society in ways that they really hadn't been since really slavery. Slavery was the last time there was this much inclusion. And so what happened was you have a tremendous level increase in relative participation and as a result in relative well-being. And it's a raising an expectation of the African American community in a powerful kind of way during the war. So I want to introduce you to this concept called the double V. Double V, and I'm going to show you the logo, was created by a newspaper out of Pittsburgh. And it says double V democracy at home and abroad. But if you gave the V sign, if you gave this sign, I should have called it that, okay? In the 60s, that's peace, right? But in World War II, if you went like that, that meant victory. This was Winston Churchill putting, the way he just tried to, build the morale of the people of Great Britain and ultimately the world with his famous V. So to do this, of course, meant victory, and V stood for victory. Well, African Americans decided to kind of, expand upon the notion. The war became increasingly a moral crusade. It was a crusade against the master racists, of course. It was a crusade against those who would commit the atrocities of a Holocaust. And so African Americans saw this as, a chance to kind of improve their relative situation. So they called upon the world to recognize, called upon America, and called upon, of course, their African American community to recognize this notion of the double V. So this meant, victory against the racism abroad. Clearly, there's a serious issue there. But also, let's remember, victory against the racism at home. So the double V. Challenge racism abroad, challenge the racism that, of course, they were very much aware of in terms of at home. So, And the war just offered them an opportunity, kind of, perceiving themselves of increased activity, increased participation, and the hopes that things would be better as far as African Americans were concerned. We do know that there is a significant increase in relative participation of African Americans. 16 million men under arms, 1 million of them were African Americans who joined the military at that time. It's not a good situation, absolutely, for sure. The Marine Corps decided they would not accept any African Americans. The Navy and the Army was less restrictive in that regard. But when they did accept them, they accepted them into segregated units. I'm sure you guys have some sense, of course, of the segregated nature of the military in terms of World War II. There is a sense, of course, that they tried to position African American soldiers in places that were more menial. So on the ships, they were often in charge of the mess, of the food production of the ships. Often for the Army, they were corpsmen who would carry, still critically important and carrying the people out. But the reality was that the war demanded combat soldiers, and so the vast majority of African American soldiers fought in battle. They're not going to be sitting somewhere behind the lines. They're going to be fighting. And indeed, they distinguished themselves, of course, just as much as any other particular group of American soldiers would distinguish themselves. And they engaged in this extraordinary effort to really challenge with, manifestations of evil. It is an amazing kind of, that World War II is the good war, right, against really evil entities from our perspective, the Nazis and even the Japanese, of course, in their particular behaviors. And it gave them experiences that were critically important. They continued to see the general hypocrisy, of course, of the American society. There was one African American fighting in the Pacific, and he wrote this little statement. He said, "Please write on my headstone, here lies a black man killed fighting a yellow man for the defense of a white man." I mean, they understood the problems of American society in no uncertain terms, but they just had this extraordinary experience would be transformative, and when they came home, of course, they would perceive their own country in a very different kind of way. One story that I found really interesting of African American soldiers was this one particular group of black soldiers liberated, or were part of the liberation of a concentration camp. I got to tell you, I can't remember if it was Buchenwald. It's in Germany, Buchenwald or Dachau. But one of the inmates of that concentration camp was Elie Wiesel, and Elie Wiesel will become the Nobel laureate, the Nobel Peace winner for poetry. And he was a little Jewish boy in this concentration camp. And he just described, the moment of this period when the war is coming to an end, the extraordinary tension, of course, of even the SS guards, and the kids are locked into their barracks, and they're hearing noises and stuff, and you can imagine how frightened they would be. And then there's a quiet period, and then all of a sudden, someone's breaking through the door to get into their barracks, and of course they're just all in their I picture them all in their little bunks, kind of in fear of what's going to come through there. And Elie Wiesel described, he said, this giant black sergeant comes in. So maybe it's just a little boy's view, of course, but this large African-American man walks in. He's got a Tommy gun in hand, and he's walking to the midst of all of these little Jewish boys, just sitting here in this area. And Elie Wiesel described, he said he came in, stood there, looked around, and then big tears just come down his his face, because he can't believe, the inhumanity of the treatment of these little Jewish boys. The Jewish boys called them the Black Angels who had come to rescue them, and indeed they would establish a relationship that would endure. I know that that generation is beginning to disappear, but has endured into relatively recent years. I think Elie Wiesel is still alive, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, these soldiers had this extraordinary experience. They came home to the United States after it, and I always have an image of this, like here's a sergeant, who's fought in D-Day and that kind of stuff, and he gets off the bus in Birmingham, Alabama, and the first thing that happens is, he's got his campaign ribbons right here, and the first thing that happens is some white man calls him boy, And they just weren't going to take it anymore. A new attitude, and a new sense of self, a new identity that they're not going to have the same attitude, and they're going to come home and they're going to try to transform the world if they could. The guy that introduced the NAACP to the first NAACP chapter to Mississippi was Medgar Evers, and he was a veteran of World War II. And so he's not going to take the crap of Mississippi anymore. And I got to tell you, for his troubles, he was gunned down by a white supremacist in his driveway as he got out of his car one day. But these guys were willing to fight the fight, to transform America. And many people would argue that the World War II is a foundation of the civil rights movement in terms of the United States of America. So, the whole soldier experience is really important. And, whenever I think of this, I also think of another veteran by the name of Jackie Robinson. who was willing to cross the color line of Major League Baseball and suffer all kinds of indignities that, his hair went prematurely gray just because of, having to hold himself back against all of the racism that was and the vitriol that was put upon him. But the black soldiers come back and they're going to see America differently, and they're going to behave differently too. Over 1 million African Americans were able to leave the South. It's critically important, there's this huge demand for labor, and so they needed them in places like Detroit, and they needed them in the Bay Area, and they needed them in Los Angeles for the airframe industry. And you see this fairly significant migration taking place of African Americans. And moving out of the South, and just moving out of the South was such a good thing, right? You move away from just the homeland of Jim Crow, and you move someplace where, if nothing else, you got the vote, right? And the jobs were better, and the income was better, and life expectancy got better. All these things. It's wartime, and yet things are getting better for the African Americans. I do want you to know that it wasn't perfect. Of course, it never is. The ambiguity of change. You had African Americans moving to Detroit to work in the war industries, but you also had Southern whites, that are moving in the same place. And you've got them competing for jobs and competing for neighborhoods. And it created a volatile cultural mix, and it explodes. In 1943, we see race riots breaking out in places like Detroit. The Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles are a little bit different, but including African Americans, but also Latinos. Just this kind of new volatile intermixing that's occurring, and it's at least a suggestion of intermixing, but also that it was hard adjustment, and there will be a price to pay here, including race riots that occurred during World War II. But it does change perspective, and we see Americans, becoming more and more, African Americans becoming more and more their own advocates, an expansion in the number of people who are members of the NAACP, the creation of something called CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality. The war really does have a significant impact upon the African American community, increased participation, but also increased expectation of what America should be for them, and I think that will have a significant impact in the aftermath in the post-war period on exactly how the African Americans are going to confront their relative status. So for Black America, the war was revolutionary in many ways in terms of their situation. The war was also revolutionary for women, and I'm going to manifest this by suggesting to you, or using for my identification, this not even really person, right? It's a caricature created by the War Information Board, Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter is going to be our identification. Now, I want you to know that Rosie the Riveter is just an idea created by the War Information Board. And of course, this becomes the extraordinarily famous, iconic poster associated with that. I read that I think that woman just died. I think she was in her mid-90s, if I'm not mistaken. The model for this just died over the last couple of weeks or something like that. I don't think it's anything associated with the COVID-19. She was just a very old individual. But this poster has always been so interesting to me, the famous We Can Do It poster. It's a woman, of course, she's rolling up, she's in kind of a khaki outfit, she's got her hair up in the bandana. She's rolling up her sleeve on what is really a very disproportional arm. But I'll tell you what, that arm can knock you out. You look at that arm, it's a strong arm. And the War Information Board was doing two things here. On the one hand, it was honoring women for their efforts in terms of the war activity. On the other hand, it was wanting them, calling them to become an increased part of the war effort. Now, it was critically important for women to become involved because during the war, an amazing number, 16 million American men were under arms during this time. Just a huge number of Americans who simply are taken away from the larger economy to become part of the war effort. And of course, it created a huge labor demand. All of a sudden, there's a monster vacuum, which did pull African Americans in. I already mentioned that to you guys. But it is also going to pull women in a major way. During World War II, it is estimated that about 6 million women entered the workforce. And so this is clearly they're hearing the clarion call of the need. We need the people to work in the war industries, and women did respond in a very powerful kind of way. Now, that they did this, of course, there's a unique component to it. Women have always worked one way or the other, and of course, it's often a kind of a class-specific type of situation. Hey, Gus, want to say hi to everybody for me? Gus is a nice old kid. Anyway, he's not that old. I think he's only 3 years old. Anyway, but the women who started to work during World War II, they're kind of unique in terms of the presentation of women at work. So they tended to be a little bit older than they had been traditionally. The average age of the women working in World War II was 35 years of age, and so that was kind of unique. It used to be kind of a young woman's game, work until you got married, and then of course you're not going to be in the job force anymore. Many of them were married, and so that was kind of a revolutionary component to the whole thing. And not only were they married, but they were mothers. So this is like the first significant manifestation of middle-class working women. And it seems so funny that that's an issue. Today, women are I think the largest single component of the workforce today, more than men. And yet this was new, to have working women, working mothers and children from the middle class. The lower classes, women had always had to work, understand that part. But the middle class, women are now starting to work, and that's kind of the revolutionary component of what's happening in World War II. Now, they go to work, of course, as I told you, 6 million of them, and a large part of the change here is that they began to work not just in women's work, but in kind of the male prerogative zone of work. So they're doing the jobs that had been previously reserved to women, to men, excuse me. So what was Rosie doing? I already told you Rosie was a riveter, and what the heck is riveting? Well, it's putting metal sheets together, of course, and it's kind of like a screw, but I think, you're causing it to be more permanent than a screw. The two sides are flattened out to hold everything together. So Rosie was riveting, Rosie was welding, and lots of women work, by the way, in the airframe industry, and that's a huge component of what's happening in Southern California. About 65% of the airframe industry, creating the actual framing or the structure of the airplane. The engines were produced back east and then brought out to California, put together in terms of the airframe, and it was just, a good place to assemble, a good place to, fly them to make sure that they were functional. But Rosie was riveting, Rosie was welding. Lots of women worked up in the shipyards in San Francisco, making the Liberty ships in terms of what was happening in California. Women were engaged in construction. Women were taxi drivers. Women were mail people. I was going to say mailman, of course, but delivering the post. Did that. Women were lumberjacking, just everything you can think of, basically. I even came across a situation where there were some women that were becoming football coaches. I think it's the first time ever in American history that women were coaching football teams because, of course, of the dearth of men available to that. I do want you to know, and I always think it's so cool, that during the World War II, of course, they created a league of their own. I got to tell you, I love that movie when it came out, just an amazing movie even to this day. And one of the things I liked the most was that it was inspiring for my daughters. My daughters were young then. I thought, I want you both to grow up to be athletic, and to play sports and stuff like that. They played volleyball. They didn't play baseball or softball, but they did play volleyball, and I was very much happy about that. Around 400,000 women served in the military, so it's not just, of course, in the kind of general economy, but around 4,000. They served as WACs and WAVES, Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAVES. Number of nurses, of course, are going to serve in the military in a variety of different places. But one thing I forgot to tell you, for instance, if they built those planes in California, they had to get them to the front. So women were the ferry pilots. They're going to take the planes from wherever they were constructed and get them to the front, so of course the men can take them actually into battle. But we do have 400,000 women in the military during World War II, including my aunt Pat, my mom's sister. Her older sister was a WAC. Tragically, I think she might have gone just a little bit wacko during that time too, but that's another story, okay? Anyway, so, this expanded participation, which was, of course, critically important as far as women were concerned. There is a liberating component to this, so the women were wearing pants much more often than they did. It's kind of really the beginning of, I know that there are some fashion components, fashion statements of the 20s and 30s where women were wearing pants a little bit, but it became so much more part of the story. In fact, I think what we say is that the women kind of fell in love with like their Levi's, and after the war, of course, they want them for their children or something like that. They really boost to the Levi company. But women start wearing pants, and pants are just more comfortable in so many ways and so functional. Every time I wear a dress, of course, I feel somewhat uncomfortable by it, I got to tell you. But anyway, pants, they start to wear the pants. They're going to the bars after work, of course. They're having a beer and all, So there was kind of, a greater movement into that male prerogative zone, that kind of a continuation of what they had begun to do as far as the 1920s are concerned. So increased participation, they're making money, of course, increased involvement in the economy. But understand that it wasn't perfect at all. We see tremendous inequality, of course, in terms of what's happening in the workforce. They were not paid the same as men for doing the exact same job. It seems like there's a glass ceiling over their head all the time, so they're working on the floors of the factory, but the supervisors, of course, the foremen, are always going to be men. The Night Shift movie with Goldie Hawn it both shows us the situation and of course the heroic activities of one woman who kind of pushes her way through the glass ceiling. But it's not equal. It's not equal today, of course. So it wasn't equal during World War II. And then the other thing that I was thinking was it's just so hard on women during World War II is that all they did was expand the area, the things they had to do, right? So they have a job, but they also have to take care of the kids in the house. Even when the husband was at home, there was this real gross inequality. The man thought that all he had to do was bring home the bacon. Well, what about when the woman is bringing home the bacon, but also having to cook it, of course, and have to take care of the kids? You do see the burden of women increasing dramatically. And I think that has been one of the most difficult parts of our modern world. Women are achieving a level of equality, but still seem to have most of the burden of the household and the children placed upon them. I do want to show that I tried to be as egalitarian as I could in terms of my marriage and our situation. I do most of the cooking. I always tried to do half of the housework. I probably changed more diapers than my wife did in terms of our baby. Anyway, I'm not saying that I came anywhere near close to doing half of it, but that was my effort. That was my attempt because I think that's what we should do. Anyway, so it's not perfect. Oh, and I wanted to tell you, the kids' problem. Childcare was basically non-existent during World War II, and women were always scrambling to figure out something. The mothers were scrambling to do something with their kids, so they would take them to the movie theater and just drop them off there. They would leave them in the car for the graveyard shifts, and you'd go out at your coffee break to make sure that they were okay sleeping in the back. Or there were just a whole bunch of latchkey children that they would go home and they'd have to fend for themselves. And we do see that juvenile delinquency increases dramatically. All these latchkey kids. I was not a latchkey kid, so I don't quite get it. But I'll never forget it. We had a friend who lived up in Marin County, and we visited him, and he was a classic latchkey kid. So mom and dad were both professionals. They worked all day, and he did what he wanted. And he takes me out kind of on one, I can't remember how old, I think I was like 11 years old. This guy was like a burglar. He went into everyone's house in the neighborhood, primarily just stealing, popsicles and ice cream and stuff like that. But I thought, holy crap. So that's what a latchkey kid is all about. Anyway, there was expanded opportunity, of course. There was expanded participation, and just the sense, of course, of accomplishment of being part of the larger war effort. All of these, make World War II revolutionary for women. Rosie the Riveter is a heroic figure, and all the women, of course, who did what she was trying to do, all of them were heroes also. So there's one last group I want to tell you about, a minority that was impacted by World War II. In this case, there's nothing really good to tell you. Okay, it's a very negative, it's a sad story, and it's a very problematic story of American history. And the story is the story of Japanese internment. I'm sure you guys have at least some sense of what this is all about, but let me just tell you what happened. And this is a potential identification for the final examination. In February of 1942, Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, issued Executive Order 9066. He issued Executive Order 9066. The Executive Order of 9066 called for the removal and relocation of all Japanese Americans who were living on the Pacific Coast. So that means all Japanese Americans who lived in the states of California, Oregon, and Washington. The individual Japanese Americans who lived in that area would be removed from those states and relocated to camps scattered across the United States of America. Of those that were, when this came down, of course, it would lead to the removal of some 120,000 Japanese Americans living in the Pacific Coast states. 2/3 of them full American citizens, so born and raised in the United States of America. And many of those who were not American citizens had not been allowed. It was against the law for them to become citizens, so it's not their fault that they weren't. But these are citizens that we presume are protected under the Constitution of the United States, but all of a sudden, declared to be these, enemy aliens, and to be dealt with in that particular kind of way. The Japanese Americans were rounded up and given relatively short notice for this, in like 48 hours often to be assembled. They were originally taken to just assembly locations, sometimes located in like horse racing tracks in the stable areas, like it's Santa Anita or Del Mar racetracks. They would take them, and of course, just going from your home, of course, just pulled out of your home, your farm, your business, your school, where you would go, to be placed now in a stable. You can imagine kind of the shocking feeling that was associated with that. They would ultimately be sent to some 11 camps scattered primarily across the interior area of the United States of America. The furthest to the east was in Arkansas, and the furthest to the west were in the state of California. There were ultimately two in California. The one way up in the northeastern part of California was called Tule Lake. That was the largest of the internment camps, but also kind of the worst of them. It was where they put the undesirables, the people that would protest. Even though it seems like everyone's right to protest this kind of incarceration, those who protest would find themselves in difficulty, and they would be sent to Tule Lake, and Tule Lake was kind of like the harshest of all of the internment camps. The other one, much closer to us, this was located at Manzanar, a place called Manzanar in the Owens Valley. If you guys have ever gone up Highway 395, and I think you're going it's north of Lone Pine for sure, but it could be a little bit north of Independence also. And you'll see, there in the good old days there was almost nothing there, just remnants kind of. And I think there was like a tower, and there's a big gymnasium type building which I think houses, the equipment for the road equipment for Inyo County or something like that. But they've done a little bit better there in terms of the interpretation, and you can go there. There's a kiosk, and so it is kind of an interesting place to stop by on your way to Mammoth or something like that if you're heading up to Tahoe. But Manzanar was the one that was closest to us here in California. So we have this, roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans who are all sent to these current internment camps scattered across the United States of America. And the question, of course, becomes, why? Why would this happen? So a component part of the question, of course, is, were these people a threat? And, you have to make an assumption that, why else would they do this? They must have some notion of that they were a threat. And I have to tell you that there is absolutely zero evidence that any of the Japanese Americans who lived in California, Oregon, and Washington ever posed any danger at all to the United States of America. Intriguingly, the Japanese Americans who lived in Hawaii, and it's about 150,000 of them there actually is some evidence of sabotage and espionage taking place, and yet none of them are interned, okay? It's only going to occur on the mainland of the United States, but were they a threat? I have to tell you that there's just no evidence that they were a threat whatsoever. One indication that they weren't a threat was that 14,000 of them are allowed out of the camps to serve in the military. And admittedly, of course, most of them would be serving in Europe. It was confusing. It could be confusing if they were in the Pacific Theater. So they were sent to the European theater, which, and they will serve with great valor, to say the least. I don't know if you guys ever heard of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit in the United States military. They fought in Africa, they fought in Sicily, they fought in Italy, they fought after D-Day. They suffered the highest casualties too, but they're so dangerous that they're being allowed to go to the front lines to fight for the United States of America. So clearly there's just no significant evidence of any kind of threat whatsoever. I want to tell you just one other anecdote. So there was a young man who was going to the University of Washington, and when the call for the relocation came out, he didn't answer the call. He didn't go. He was basically conscientiously objecting to that situation. So he ultimately was tried in a federal court for violating this, and he was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. And he was tried in Seattle, but he was to go to a federal penitentiary down in Arizona. And when the judge finally rendered the verdict and the sentence, he simply told the young man that he was to get to the penitentiary on his own recognizance. So that means he's supposed to just go there on his own, okay? And you all know that you do not let a dangerous criminal leave the courthouse and go to the prison on their own. They're making assumption, of course, that he would do, and he did. He was a good kid. So he goes down to Arizona. I don't know, got there hitchhiked or something. Knocks on the door of the penitentiary. Hi, I'm here. These guys are not a threat to anybody, and almost everybody kind of knew what was going on. So then the question is, why? Why were these Japanese Americans interned? And the one thing I forgot to do, they're placed in the camps. The camps were called relocation centers, but they're concentration camps surrounded by perimeter fencing, and often double perimeter fencing, armed guards. There were dogs. There were towers with lights at night. Of course, no one could go in that they didn't want to go in, and no one could go out that they didn't want to go out. So I mean, clearly, these were concentration camps in their own particular kind of way. So the question becomes, why did the Americans do this? And the kind of things we focus on are war fears. Clearly, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Americans were terrified. My mom was 7 years old at that time, and she kind of even now remembers the fear generated by that moment. And in California, on the coast, they were panicking, basically. And of course, they did blackouts all along the coast. I mean, if the Japanese could pull off a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, how much harder was it to come over all the way across the entire, to the Pacific, to the United States? And, there were some interesting approaches of submarines and other kind of things that they tried to do. Very little of it's going to happen. But, I mean, every single day on the California coast, the civil defense guys were just, standing with binoculars, spanning the horizon, basically, in fear. So the fear was palpable. It was powerful at that time. And it's hard for us to imagine how fearful they were, of course. And, the suggestion is that's going to lead them, of course, against the Japanese Americans. I think, one of the powerful factors is just scapegoating. So this is an ancient thing where you're simply trying to find someone to blame. And who's to blame for Pearl Harbor? Well, of course, Imperial Japan, but also the ineptitude of the United States and not paying attention to what the Japanese were doing. I mean, there's all kinds of potential warnings here that they're not listening to. But that's not the way it's going to play out, right? You're going to blame someone that you can identify. And the Japanese Americans were simply identifiable. It was a manageable group. You probably know that they didn't do the same kind of thing to the Germans who lived in America or to the Italians. And in large part because there are just so many. In truth, there were some Germans, more recent Germans who were interned, and there were more Italians that were interned. So there actually are a significant number of Italians that will be interned. But, the Japanese Americans, a small, identifiable group, it's kind of easy. Yeah, let's turn on them, okay? Let's make them the bad guys in terms of the story. So I do think that scapegoating is at least a part of the story. I've already mentioned to you the issue of racism. The people of California were, already kind of hostile in this anti-Asian tradition, in first part generated against the Chinese, later generated against the Japanese Americans. It wasn't hard for them to, that's the problem, right? We argue that, like in Europe, not everyone's going to be a Nazi, but there was a mild anti-Semitism, and a mild racism against the Jews that was sort of generic in Germany and other places like that. So it wasn't that hard for them to kind of agree to this kind of, to the behaviors that, of course, and they could pretend they didn't know exactly what the Nazis were doing with the Jews, but something like that, not exactly, of course, but something like that in America, a racism either mild or very intense, I should say, that would allow the Americans to quickly at least believe that the Japanese Americans were a problem, that maybe it was a good idea to remove them to these camps. I do think that a big factor in California especially is economic jealousy. Japanese, especially against the Japanese American farmers, they were just so good at what they did. In my California class, I'd tell how, I can't remember when it is, it's the early part of the 20th century, but Japanese Americans represented 1% of the farmers in America, in California, 1%, and yet they produced 10% of the product of California. So very good, very efficient farmers who were able to make good money off of that. And so, the idea here is that there's a lot of American farmers who are looking at the Japanese Americans and saying, man, that's a problematic competition. What do you say we kind of, help get rid of them if they possibly could? And indeed, one of the things that I'm missing some things here, they weren't given enough time to dispose of their income or their properties. You can't really get rid of a house or a business or a farm in 48 hours. So we estimate that they're going to lose about $500 million worth of personal property. So a tremendous amount of personal property is lost in terms of real estate, and personal property is lost in terms of this location. So, in some ways this may have been intentional, that these California farmers wanted to get rid of the competition that they were struggling against. And then finally and critically, there is a component of political opportunism. I think that's one of the things we always have to be so attentive to. Why do politicians do the things that they do? Are they just playing the game to gain attention to themselves? And in California, it simply seemed politically expedient for many of the California politicians to play with the fear, on the fear of the Japanese. Many of them knew that there was no significant threat, but by standing up to these Japanese Americans, it made them look heroic, at least in the eyes, of course, of those of their supporters. So political opportunism clearly is part of the story as far as Japanese internment is concerned. In the end, of course, it just becomes in many ways an American tragedy. All these people sent to these camps, people that their nation betrayed them, basically. I mean, that's what's happening here. It always makes me think of, just kind of interactions I've had with some Japanese Americans. When I was in college, I met a girl by the name of Joy Kagawa. She was a roommate of my girlfriend. And it took me a while to get to know her enough till I could feel comfortable doing this, but I finally did. And I said, Joy, one day I just said, Joy, were your mom and dad, your grandparents in the internment camps, And the answer she gave me was just so telling about the situation. She said, yes, they were, but she said, I knew nothing about it until she went to high school. So her high school history teacher was the one who enlightened her as to the components of, the activities of Japanese internment. She said it was something in their family that they just didn't talk about. Well, there are things in my family that we don't talk about too, and they're not necessarily very good things, So it just seems so sad. Put into these camps, forced to live, of course, in these collective situations. Routinely, the camps were not terribly comfortable. Manzanar is a beautiful location in the Owens Valley, Sierra Nevada, right there. White Mountains to the other side, but super hot, dry in the summertime, super cold in the wintertime. And the food was often problematic, and there wasn't privacy, and the relative position of the parents was disintegrated kind of in the face of this. Fathers especially, fathers were very important in the Japanese American family, and yet here, of course, they had almost no significant power whatsoever. And I do want you to know that Japanese Americans did everything they could to make a life for themselves. If you look into it, you see that they did art, they did photography, there was educational activities, they were Boy Scouts, they played sports, they had baseball teams, they did the whole, as much as they could, they tried to normalize their existence. And yet, of course, it was just always sitting there in the situation that the society has turned against them and incarcerated them, And so in the end, the significance of Japanese internment, it's hard to kind of, give you a sense of exactly what, I would say here. But it's kind of like the dangers of war in a multicultural society. We have to be very careful how we behave, when let's say a conflict starts. Are we going to turn against the people who, it would be maybe Islamic people in more recent years, just because they're Islamic, does that mean that they are specifically connected to terrorists? And of course the answer is no. The Islamic religion is as peaceful as any religion is. Christianity's been very unpeaceful upon occasion, so you're always going to have your outliers in their behaviors, but it's always dangerous to turn against an element within your society, of course, in some kind of a situation like war. And I guess the only thing we can hope to do is avoid these kind of activities in the future. Anyway, with that, I will close out my little relatively brief presentation on World War II, and I will be coming back to see you relatively soon.